Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to UFO Think Tank with your host, Alejandro Rojas.
All right, everybody, welcome to the show, UFO Think Tank. My name is Alejandro Rojas. I'm your host. Your co-host for this show will be a little chihuahua by the name of Tessa. She actually does security, so you may hear her in the background kind of barking off and staving off the MIB should they try to disrupt our amazing UFO radio show that we're starting up here tonight. First, I want to kind of introduce myself. My name's Alejandro Rojas. One thing that I do that is probably the most important thing I do in this field, which is the Director of Public Education for the Mutual UFO Network. And if you're not familiar with that group, the acronym is MOVE-ON, and we're the largest UFO investigation organization in the country. We actually do investigations throughout the world. We are watching the skies over the entire planet. In fact, you may be familiar with us because we had a television show on the Discovery Channel recently called UFOs Over Earth, where we did sort of our investigation. We're very scientific and rigorous. We're careful. We're criticized for that because, you know, we really delve into what we can substantiate, and we try to look for proof and evidence. So we try to stay away from the sort of stating things that we can't back up. Of course, everybody has their opinions, which is great. And when you look at the UFO, we have literally thousands of members, 3,000 members throughout the country, hundreds of investigators looking into these sightings. And the opinions vary. There's some people who are really into the contactees and, you know, what are the Arcturians and the Pleiadians saying right now. And some of them, mostly with our group, are very rigorous. And what can you prove? Even kind of a little skeptical when it comes to this, which is important for us because with MUFON, we are really held as one of the most reputable organizations in this arena. And for that, we've been very popular with the media. Of course, Discovery Channel, as I mentioned, had done a show with us. We've been on ABC, and I've interviewed with a lot of these people as MUFON spokesperson. We've been on ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, MSNBC, a History Channel. We work a lot with the UFO Hunters, that television show. We love those guys. They're some of our buddies. And we've worked with CNN. We've been on Larry King. So, and I've been on Coast to Coast quite a few times as well, so you might have heard me there. I also recently have been doing the UFO Not radio show through Blog Talk Radio and helping out with that. That is in conjunction with UFO TV and Jesse Randolph as a host. They do a great job over there. And actually, I hosted a couple of the shows recently, but I wanted to start my own show because I have a website called UFO Think Tank. I've actually been an investigator for about 8 years now, where I've really hardcore delved into this arena and gotten to know the people behind the scenes. And really, that's what's brought me to this. With my UFO Think Tank website, which has gotten pretty popular, I've been able to get a lot of great information out there, and I put items of interest, some news bulletins up there so people can stay up to date on UFOs in the news. And believe it or not, UFOs are covered in the media throughout the world very often. So I'll talk about some of those stories in a minute. But I wanted to be able to share some of the great behind-the-scenes conversations, because there are some very interesting, extremely intelligent people in this field. And some of the best conversations happen like at the conferences or when we're hanging out together, and some really interesting in-depth information. A lot of the times on these radio programs, you're just getting to know the people. So all you hear is kind of the same spiel that they do on every radio show. So I wanted to do something more in-depth where, you know, we bring people on, we talk to them, and then we bring them on later, and we continue these conversations to really try to get to something. That's why I call the site UFO Think Tank. So it's the idea is putting our heads together to try to figure something out, because obviously the government isn't sharing with us what they know, so we can do it ourselves. We don't have to rely on them. So that's why I am doing this. I wanted to talk about tonight's guest before I get into the news, to kind of excite you about that and to entice you into continuing to listen. But tonight's guest is Dr. Claude Swanson. He's a physicist. He was educated as a physicist at MIT and Princeton University. He worked at the MIT Science Teaching Center, Brookhaven National Laboratory, and at a Virginia cyclotron. See, very technical terms here. You have to have a PhD to even conceptualize what a cyclotron is. Actually, there's very smart people out there without PhDs. I'm just trying to be funny there, but he's also worked for the Aeronautical Research Associates of Princeton, which is a consulting company, and later he formed his own consulting company, which carried out studies of applied physics for commercial and governmental agencies, including DuPont, United Technology, the U.S. Army and Navy, DARPA, and the CIA, among many other organizations. So this guy has gotten around. He knows his stuff. Also, for many years, actually, Dr. Swanson has been one of those brave enough people to pursue investigations into unconventional physics. His principal interests have been the unified field theory, this theory of everything, which could possibly explain the universe at its deepest possible levels. This has led him to investigate many aspects of the paranormal, which appear to be completely real to him, even though they violate our present science. So if you look at the site here, you can see his book, Synchronized Universe, where he talks about, you know, some of these other ideas of physics that would incorporate things that we are witnessing in the paranormal. You can also go to his website, synchronizeduniverse.com. So this is going to be a great conversation. We're going to get into the physics. If you want to know more about his background in the paranormal, you can actually go to UFO Think Tank, and at the top, and a couple places, but at the very top you'll see a link called Phenomena Television, and if you look at the very first episode there, hey, this is my first radio show. He's doing that. He was on the first episode of Phenomena TV. That just tells you how much I appreciate this guy's work and appreciate his involvement in the field, but he talks more about how he got into this. So we're not going to get so much into that. We're going to delve right into the hard science of the field. But first, I want to go over some of the interesting news about UFOs. This is going to be on the UFO Think Tank site. As soon as I get done with this radio show, I'll post it all. But right now, if you go to the UFO Think Tank site, on the bottom of the front page, you'll see lots of news stories, and I post these on a regular basis. But this is interesting. If you're not aware, the UK is UFO crazy. I don't know if it's because the name of their country is kind of that acronym, just like UFOs. They both start with a U. It's actually because the government has released a lot of UFO files recently. They've decided to release files. They're going to release them. You know, some people were under the impression they released all their files. That's not what's happened. They're releasing a little bit of files every month. So it's kind of like they're keeping us on our edge, like a good TV show where what's going to happen next. And they've enticed us with some great stuff, some sightings by people that are working at airports and sightings by police officers and university professors. So very interesting stuff. And this has all gotten the UK in this UFO craze. They're having stories in their papers, all of their papers, all over the place, all the time. And the latest big buzz out there that's getting in a lot of their papers is a UFO crashing into a windmill, a wind turbine, and breaking it into pieces. How do we know it's a UFO? That's what the witnesses said. In the morning, this turbine, and you can see pictures on some of these stories that I'm talking about. Go check out these links and you'll be able to see them. But one of the blades on the turbine has completely fallen off. One is all bent up. And the witnesses said they saw spheres of light and flying discs flying above this thing the night that it happened. So residents in the local area believe that this thing was hit by a UFO. The officials are actually taking this debris and sending it to some forensic analysis. People are going to do some forensic analysis in Germany to see if they can find out more about that. So really interesting. Also, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in particular, has been UFO crazy because what we call a flap, UFO flap, is when there are a lot of sightings in an area, and Bucks County, Pennsylvania has been one of those places lately in the last year. In fact, one of our MUFON Discovery Channel television shows covered that. So if you can catch that show, definitely do that. But it talked about that flap and some of the interesting sightings. Some very credible people have been happening. So just like in the UK, the Pennsylvania papers are full of UFO sightings. And one of them, interesting enough, is about a sighting right here in Colorado. So they picked up a little story in a small paper in Colorado about some people seeing some UFOs out here. And I say out here because that's where I am. I'm in the beautiful Denver, Colorado area. I'm actually in a southwest suburb of Denver, out here near the mountains. I'm near Lockheed Martin, which is back there in the hills and the loving arms of Mother Earth over there, and they're building their missiles and things like that over there. But so that's where I live in Colorado. So it's interesting to see this story about a Colorado sighting, which is the first time I have seen anything about it in a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania paper. By the way, as far as sightings goes, if you're not aware, MUFON, we collect literally hundreds of sightings. Last month we collected over 400 sightings, and these are people who somehow find that we exist, go to our website and report that they've seen something. In Colorado alone, we typically receive a dozen or more, and we are one of the states that receives a bit more than other states, but there are a lot of sightings around. So if you go to MUFON.com, actually if you're on my Blog Talk Radio homepage, you'll see a link on the right to MUFON.com, so check that out. Another story, an interesting video, because everybody likes to look at videos of UFOs. Is it really a UFO or not? Well, in Argentina, there were some pictures of UFOs taken over a lake. So I'm going to post a story on that. But finally, and related to our guest, who I will get to, he looks like he's on the line as soon as I finish covering this, there's an organization, a lot of people, and that's why I'm going to start off with scientists. I'm going to try to have my first few guests here be some PhDs, which there are many involved with this field. You know, a lot of people say, well, it's not credible. That's why scientists aren't involved with the field. That's why scientists don't care about the field. And that's not true at all. There are very many scientists involved with this field, and I'm going to prove it to you because I'm going to have scientists come on the show and talk about this. And there actually is an organization called the Society for Scientific Exploration, and they look into a lot of aspects of the paranormal. A lot of what they focus on is consciousness, because with quantum physics, the interesting thing is that actually a lot of these metaphysical topics are starting to relate with science and consciousness, which I think is kind of even further out there and harder to comprehend than UFOs and possible extraterrestrial visitation of the Earth. But that's what these guys are into, which is great. But they also look at a lot of different paranormal matters, including UFOs. At their last conference here in Boulder, Colorado, actually, they had a panel speaking about UFOs. And remember, this is a scientific organization. In fact, you have to have several papers written. You have to be a published PhD in order to be a full-fledged member of this organization. So some of the members look into UFOs, do UFO research, and they did some talks. And there's a video here on YouTube that I'm going to post at my site so you can take a look at this. One of those people who spoke at the SSE this past summer in Boulder, Colorado, was Claude Swanson, our guest for this evening. So we'll talk to Claude about that and the state of science and scientists getting into this. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to push my little on-air button here, and through the magic of technology, I believe that we have Claude Swanson on the phone.
Hi, Alejandro. How do I sound? I'm on a cell phone right now. Is this acceptable, or how do I sound?
Perfect. You sound great.
Okay, great.
It's working good. All right. Well, welcome, and thank you for joining. And you probably heard me just talk about the SSE, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about that. We'll start off with that and kind of your experiences this summer talking about UFOs with this scientific organization.
Yeah, the SSE, or Society for Scientific Exploration, which met in Boulder this summer, is a really wonderful national organization, and really international. And there are some, it's a sad comment on, I guess, mainstream science that it's very difficult to get some of the really important breakthrough technologies talked about in the mainstream physics journals. So if you are a credible scientist with all the hard science degrees, and you want to publish your papers, they've had to form other organizations like the SSE to provide a forum where people can publish on, say, the long-distance consciousness experiments that the Princeton Pear Lab carried out, where, over a 30-year period, they had these random event generators, and they found people were able to affect them and cause the random outputs to change based on intent, based on the setting of the mind, even thousands of miles away. And the Princeton Pear Lab, headed by Robert John and Brenda Dunn. Robert John used to be the head of the engineering department there at Princeton. He was one of the people who helped found the SSE to provide a place where people can talk about these subjects. Hal Puthoff, anyone who studies the science of these subjects comes across his name. He's been one of the leaders in studying new alternative theories for the vacuum and for how space and time can be affected if we start modifying the conditions of the vacuum, which might be the technology that's involved in some of these strange phenomena that you're talking about tonight. And he's also involved in the SSE. So I think the SSE has become a home for scientists who are interested in these new frontier areas.
And these scientists aren't like the nutty professor scientists. These are people who are published and respected in their field, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so that's great.
Many are professors at universities. Some are not, but they all have some kind of hard science backgrounds. And that's the interesting thing, that the data, the kinds of experiments that have been coming out for the past few decades really support a wide range of strange phenomena that suggest that our current scientific paradigms aren't really working, that we have a bunch of different areas where new phenomena are showing up, and probably the laws of physics that you learn in school are obsolete now, and it's time really to open our minds to some new ideas, and they may help us understand some of the strange things that are seen in UFOs and seen in paranormal and long-range consciousness effects. So we have to kind of go outside the box a little bit and consider other ideas. And the science is supposed to be driven by experiment. If experiments are saying that something happens, then you can't ignore it just because the theory says no. You have to look back at the theory and say, well, what needs to change in our current science so we can begin to understand some of these things.
And I think one of the things you touched upon a minute ago is, and one of my arguments when people talk about scientists not being involved in these subjects is that scientists themselves are involved in, but organizations or universities or larger organizations perhaps are not involved, but individuals are, which is, like you talked about, why SSE had to be created, because it seems as the media doesn't necessarily pay attention to the work of one person. They pay attention to work done in universities or laboratories.
Right, that's quite true. It certainly works better if you have an established institution backing you up, but most of us who go into science, go into the field because we want to know the truth. We're really curious about how the universe works, and the scientific method is supposed to be a search for truth. And if we observe phenomena that don't fit our current model, we're supposed to go back and modify the model and then compare that and eventually get a better understanding of how the universe works. And I think many physicists went into science with that attitude, and it's a little frustrating when you see that the institution itself doesn't really follow that basic rule.
Now, it was suggested, I was at a meeting earlier and talking with some people, and it was suggested that perhaps becoming a PhD and possibly a professor at a university or connected with one of these institutions may actually be a handicap to researching some of these fields because they're afraid of hurting their credibility.
Yeah, I think that's true. First of all, a lot of science research these days is government funded, so you have a sort of central funding source, so that professors have to send their grants to only a few major agencies, so that it's difficult to get funding if you're looking into these sort of off the mainstream areas. That's part of the problem. And there's also a groupthink mentality in academic institution that the people you talk to, there's a certain attitude there that it's hard sometimes to do out of the box thinking, so I think there is a sociological aspect to trying to take a fresh approach sometimes.
Well, I want to ask you about something in particular at the beginning here, because I want to understand this better, and maybe others can, and make sure that I'm got my facts straight here under the correct impressions. But SETI, the organization Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, they're the guys who the Contact movie was made about. Of course, you're very familiar. And they have the radio telescopes where they're listening for messages from extraterrestrial civilizations that are many thousands of millions light years away. And their main argument they have that we are not being visited by any civilizations is that it's impossible to get from there to here. And it seems that even using conventional physics, even with Einstein, it seems like using conventional physics, you can make arguments for, theoretically, that there are possibilities to move further, vast distances in small amounts of time. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, in a manner of speaking, yes, because if you're going to, say, go the 4 light years between here and Alpha Centauri, for example, if you go at a very high speed, maybe 99% the speed of light, or some very high speed, then there's a time contraction effect, so that in your frame of reference, in your spaceship, your rocket ship, the time that it takes is going to be much less than somebody in the outside world, so that there's a time contraction there that it makes it possible for people to live a normal lifespan and still travel great distances in their own frame of reference if they're traveling at high speed. So they could, they could live long enough to get from here to there or there to here if they're doing, high-speed travel like that. So that's kind of a conventional answer to the problem. I think what we're learning from a lot of the work that's going on with, as we learn more about the vacuum and the nature of the vacuum and the nature of light, is that there are probably better ways to do it. And that to me is the exciting part, is looking at whether our present theory based on Einstein is really the final word, or whether we have a lot more to learn. If you look at how far our science has come in the last 100 years, who could say how much more we're going to learn in the next 1,000 years? And then there's so many star systems, and just in the last few decades, we've discovered dozens and dozens of planets around other star systems. And it's fair to say, I think now, that there are probably half of the stars, at least, have planets around them. And so, the odds of finding the conditions for life, intelligent life, to evolve is probably much higher than we would have guessed 100 years ago. So, therefore, the odds are that there are probably some civilizations out there that have been evolving for much longer than we have. So, there are probably some sciences out there that have had a lot longer to evolve than ours, and they must know some things that we haven't figured out yet. So to take our science today and say, well, that's the final word, you can't get more advanced than we are today, is pretty foolish, because we've only had about 100 years of real progress in science. So that's sort of a first order starting point, just kind of saying, there's very unlikely that our current science is the final word. I'll be happy to talk about some of the ways we're kind of learning or getting clues about how science might change and how we might be able to do better. But just to start off with, it's just arrogant to say that our science today probably has all the answers.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of beat this subject to death to really get around it, because to me it seems like kind of a silly argument. And for one thing, I'm curious, just from my knowledge, now using Einstein's rules of physics, do they allow for the wormhole theory, this bending of space?
Einstein's special theory was his first theory of relativity. That really was just about the speed of light. But the general theory of relativity, which came a few years later, is all about gravity. And the basic idea there is that the effect of gravity is to bend space, that you could describe the effect of gravity in a very elegant, beautiful way if you say it's really the warping of space-time, so that a beam of light, when it thinks it's going in a straight line, really ends up traveling in a curve, because it's just kind of trying to follow the shortest distance, and the space is curved. So that's kind of the modern picture of Einstein's general relativity theory. And what people began noticing in the late 1930s is that if you have a very strong mass, a very condensed star that's, say, collapsed, that as you get close to it, the gravity gets stronger and stronger, and at some point the curvature becomes so great that you can't really follow the solutions of the space-time. The curvature becomes so great that the inside solution and the outside solution virtually become independent of each other. And that's where the wormhole idea came from, because physicists realized that if you could follow this curvature of space-time into a very dense star, and then after a while you wouldn't be able to get out of it, and you could connect that solution with another solution on the other side, which would be another space-time that would be kind of glued right to the one that you're falling into. So that's where the wormhole idea came from. Now, we don't really know for sure if there are wormholes or not, or if Einstein's theories, are ultimately correct. But that's where it came from, and it is sort of a legitimate conclusion from his equations.
And even with gravity, that's an interesting thing too, because of course it's something we deal with every day. It's something we base a lot of science on. I was in an airplane yesterday, and I'm putting my faith into our understanding of gravity when I'm stepping into there. And luckily, my faith was well placed because I made it. But gravity isn't something that we understand too well either. Is that correct?
No, I think you're right. Experiments have been done. There are a variety of experiments trying to measure the strength of gravity, and some of those, the constant of gravity is not really as constant or as well defined as many other constants of physics. In fact, Einstein's theory really only rests on about 3 basic experiments that, mostly because gravity is kind of a weak force, so it's hard to do experiments that are really definitive. So there are only a few effects that really kind of helped theorists to nail down gravity, and so it's pretty easy to find other models of gravity that would probably fit the same facts we have and may lead to other predictions as you go to other conditions, like adding electric fields or magnetic fields, or in the case of very strong fields. So there's probably a lot of leeway for us to learn more about gravity as we go along here. So I think that, well, you take dark matter, for example. When I was in grad school in the 70s, and I was in Robert Dickey's gravity group, and we were studying gravity, that was our purpose, studying cosmology and building instruments to attempt to measure the conditions of the universe. And no one ever talked about dark matter. No one, it didn't exist as far as anybody was concerned, and you could find physicists in those days who would talk very confidently about the Big Bang theory and how Einstein's theory really worked great and explained the universe and everything all fit together, and no one ever, had any indication there was such a thing as dark matter. That's kind of come in the last, decade or two, and it's really, you could say in a way it's a fudge, because what we find is that there are these big clusters of star systems, and there's sort of too much gravity there for the galaxies that we can count. The velocities tell us that there's more of a pull than there should be based upon Einstein's gravity. So we say, we'll have to make up something that's causing that extra pull, and so we're going to call it dark matter. And you say, well, what is it? No one really knows, and that, of course, theoretical physicists love that situation where you have a question and you have really no ability to tie it down very well. So lots of people have written theories about what dark matter might be. To me, one of the most promising ideas has to do with a Russian concept called torsion, that they may have sort of figured out what dark matter is from another direction. But the point is that what we thought we understood, namely Einstein's equations, all of a sudden nature threw us a curveball, and we have this whole new effect of extra gravity in these certain areas that was not predicted by his theory. And then, of course, we have now dark energy. Some of the areas have just the opposite effect, where things are not, kind of pushing away from each other. So how do you explain that? Well, gravity is not supposed to push away. It's supposed to just pull things toward each other. So they say, well, that's dark energy. That pushes the other way. And obviously you can keep doing this and never really admit that the theory might need some fixing.
Yeah, and that's what's been funny with the dark matter. You still there?
Yeah.
With the dark matter, I mean, it's something in science that nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows if it is. If I'm right, the astronomer who even discovered that the universe was still expanding, which allows for, what's going on, she doesn't believe in dark matter. But it's okay for the media and everybody to talk about dark matter. And it just paralleling with the UFO phenomena, we have evidence. We have a lot of people with sightings. We have pictures and photographs and things that can't be explained. So there's something there, but it's not even okay to talk about it. Even though in science it is okay to talk about things that we don't know about, but a phenomena that's observed.
Yeah, I think to me it's exciting that there are things we don't understand. I mean, there's still work left to do, and to me,
job security for guys like you.
Yeah, exactly, something to do. But that's the fun part, and I think if students in college were exposed to the unanswered questions, what the problems are, that it would be a lot more exciting, they'd be more interested in going into science. These people who try to present it as though everything is all figured out, it's just not the case.
Yep. A couple of the things that you mentioned earlier, I'd ask to ask more about for us laymen. You talked about gravity being a weak force, and I tripped on the ice the other day, and I fell just to the ground, and that hurt pretty good, so it didn't feel like a weak force. What do you guys mean when you talk about gravity being a weak force?
I think it's really relative to the other dominant force that physics deals with, and that's electromagnetism. That electromagnetism governs so much of the things that go on in our life. It's in the wires, it's in our electronics, it's in the phone that I'm speaking over, it's in the radio waves. But more than that, it's the electrons that orbit around the outside of all the atoms, and they attract each other so that the matter itself is held together primarily by electromagnetic forces. So that electromagnetism is really, so the other kind of universal force that most often comes up in physical phenomena. And if you look at, say, two electrons, let's say, they have a certain charge on them, and they exert a certain force between, one with the other based on that electrical force. Now they also have a mass, and so they have a certain gravitational force that also causes them to be pulled together. Well, that gravitational force is 10 to the 40th times smaller than the electrical force, and that's 1 with 40 zeros. So what it says is that the electrical force between two charged particles is 10 to the 40th time stronger than the gravitational force. So that's really why we say it's a weak force. It's mostly compared to electromagnetism. And of course, luckily, most atoms have equal numbers of positive and negative charges, so they're neutral, so that we don't see pure electrical forces very often. They're mostly canceled out, and so you still get to feel that attraction to the Earth from gravity, but just be thankful that you weren't electrically charged when you fell.
Yeah, I would have been fried, huh?
Right.
So another one of the things that you mentioned, now getting more into the theory and getting into some of these other things that allow, and maybe you can kind of explain that, allow us to possibly go vast distances in shorter amounts of times. You had mentioned the vacuum. What is that? How would you describe, what is the vacuum when you talk about that?
Well, the most popular idea of the vacuum is it's empty space. There's nothing there. That's sort of the old idea. Nowadays, for a scientist, the vacuum is really everywhere. That if you look at, say, the air, a gas, for example, you have particles, you have atoms and molecules in the air, but between them, there's still nothing. There's still a vacuum. Okay, even inside an atom, you have electrons orbiting around the nucleus, but most of what's there is empty space. The particles themselves are very, very tiny compared to the amount of space, so that the vacuum is kind of like the universal fluid that's really everywhere. Even where there's matter, there's still, the vacuum is very important. In the old picture in the days of Newton, they thought of the vacuum as just being, like a blackboard. There's just a place for the particles to move around, and that's really all it is. When quantum theory emerged in the early part of the last century, people began realizing there has to be a lot more happening in the vacuum. The uncertainty principle tells us that if you try to look in a very small region of space, the uncertainty of energy and of momentum becomes much greater. In other words, the smaller the volume, the smaller the distance, the smaller the time that you're looking into, the greater the uncertainty, which means there's fluctuating energy that's required to be there by the uncertainty principle. And quantum theory, goes a lot further in terms of describing exactly how much there should be and things like that. But the point is that the picture that you end up with in the quantum model is that there's a seething mass of energy, of particles being created and destroyed, of photons being created and destroyed, and the smaller scale you look at, the more activity there is. So the vacuum is not empty. It's not nothing. It's really pretty busy, and it's really sort of that busyness, that activity is probably really plays an important role in the way particles behave.
Mm-hmm. And so that's where. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, in other words, so what happens if you want to change the rules of physics? I mean, there's sort of a new field emerging. Some people call it vacuum engineering. If you realize that energy and those particles and that fluctuating sea of energy is really what is determining our physics, that energy may actually be what causes the attraction between charged particles. That energy has to be there for our laws of physics to work the way they do. And so if you could change the nature of that seething mass of energy, you may be able to change the rules of physics in that vicinity. One really simple experiment along those lines involves having an atom just sitting in space, and it's excited. So the electrons that are at a higher energy level in the atom than they normally would be. And so over time, that electron will fall down to its lowest energy level and give off a photon, and that's normal. But if you put it in a certain kind of cavity, a certain reflecting cavity that does not allow a photon to be present in the cavity of the right wavelength, then you can change the way that atom decays. So what I'm really trying to say is that by changing the mirrors, the reflections around a piece of space, you change the types of vibrations, types of frequencies that are allowed in that space, and then you change the properties of the space. In the same way, our idea about the speed of light is really dependent on a couple of basic properties of space, and the dielectric constant, etc. And if you can change those, then you can change the speed of light. So it's possible, at least theoretically, by changing the characteristics of this vacuum, to do engineering where you could change the speed that light propagates in that region.
It almost sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong here again too, then, if you change the speed of light, as far as thinking of propulsions and thinking of ways to travel vast distances, then you can kind of change time where you could travel a long period of time if you change this area of space. But to the outside of this space, it wouldn't seem like it was a long period of time. But inside it would. Is that the kind of thing that you're saying could be possible?
Exactly. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity, of general relativity, kind of has these ideas built into it as a possibility without really maybe explaining how you would do it. He allows for time to go slower or faster and for space to warp. So, by having what he calls the metric, which is the curvature of space-time, built into his equations, that potential exists for changing it. And as you may know, there was one scientist named Alcubierre who a decade or so ago, I'm not sure how long ago it was, published a solution of Einstein's equations that would propagate faster than light. And it did it by basically creating a warp, which would allow things to travel faster than light, at least as seen from the outside. And it would take, it's not a very practical solution. It would take enormous masses, to make this thing happen. But it was the first demonstration that Einstein's equations don't rule out things traveling faster than light. I think a practical solution would require something more like what we're talking about with vacuum engineering, where you can change the properties of space-time locally by understanding the vacuum and by changing its properties. The Casimir effect is one more example you've probably heard about that also illustrates that the vacuum is not empty and that its properties, really can be modified. The Casimir effect basically happens when you have two metal plates that you allow to become very close to each other. If they're mirrored metal plates, they become like a cavity, and they sort of exclude certain frequencies from existing in between the two metal plates, while outside the metal plates, all the frequencies are allowed. And so by changing the vibrations or by changing the allowed frequencies in a certain space, then the outside space kind of pushes in more because it's not being balanced by all those same frequencies on the inside. So it's a real simple example that's been demonstrated in the laboratory as being real, that says these energies are real and you can really produce forces from them. So it's a simple example of how you can engineer space-time.
Mm-hmm. So all of this is kind of confirming what I thought, which is that the SETI guys, when they're sticking to this, there's no way they could travel that far, we haven't ruled out that travel beyond light speed isn't possible. So it seems like a really silly statement.
Well, they're going to make it anyway.
Yeah, unfortunately. So
until somebody demonstrates one to them, and even after that, they might not acknowledge it. It's the old thing that if you have a hammer, then everything is a nail, And so they have their telescopes to pick up radio waves. So for them, all that's worth picking up is radio waves. And if you have there's something that is disc-shaped that's hovering outside your window, they're not going to look at it if it doesn't show up on their radio telescope. So.
So cool. So I was right. They're goofballs. So, and you brought up a couple other interesting aspects. A lot of stuff, of course. Now we're talking, some of this Star Trek type of stuff could be happening. And it sounds like you've almost got it figured out. So, why don't you get on that? Can you build us some kind of localized engineering vacuum of space? We could be talking here face to face.
For me, Alejandro, what I have found the most fascinating aspect of this is the consciousness aspect that you mentioned earlier. Because I began hearing about remote viewing many years ago, and to me it is connected with these other problems, because if there are ways for the conscious mind to get access to distant events, and there's really, in remote viewing experiments, space and time also are not a limitation. And like in the Princeton Pear Lab experiments I mentioned before, where they're affecting random event generators thousands of miles away, and they even can do experiments where they affect it last week. As long as no one has looked at this REG, this random event generator, they can store the data up and look at it a week later, and they can still affect the outcome. So there are some bizarre effects in terms of space and time and consciousness that, to me, they're all part of this same puzzle. They're all connected, and when we figure out one piece of it, we'll probably figure out the whole thing.
Well, and I like the story about the kitten, the experiment with the kitten that you talk about in your lectures. So maybe you could share that one with that consciousness remote viewing type of experiment they did.
Okay, let's see. Well, one of the experiments, I'm not sure which one it is, but
the meowing.
Yeah. Okay. People talk about out-of-body experiences. Okay, and of course this comes up fairly often when people have UFO encounters. A lot of people have report out-of-body experiences, things like that. And, of course, in the parapsychology area, many people are able to manage their own out-of-body experiences. I've been to Monroe Institute a couple of different times in Virginia, where they use hemisync tapes to help people have out-of-body experiences. And some people believe that when you do remote viewing, you're basically having an out-of-body experience. but of course that's the perspective of the person doing it, and the skeptic, even just the objective observer might say, well, that's just your imagination. There's nothing real physical going on when you do that. But there have been a number of experiments that contradict that show that when you're having an out-of-body experience, there is something detectable that actually does leave the body and goes to the remote location. And the kitten experiment is just one of several like this. And let me, if I can, mention a couple other experiments that were done around the same time.
No, you stick to the kitten. Just kidding. No, please do.
Yeah, because the Chinese back in the 80s had some very gifted remote viewers, and they put Chinese characters, the 50,000 different Chinese characters, and they put one in an envelope, a sealed envelope, next to a piece of photographic film. And what they found is that when the remote viewer was able to correctly read the Chinese character, and this would be miles away in another location, when he could see that correct character, he also caused the film to be exposed, which means that there's some kind of energy that was present at the location of the character. It's as though whatever the consciousness aspect of us that enables us to see these things carries an energy with it, and it changes the physics of space-time and was causing that film to be exposed. Another set of experiments done in the 70s by Carlos Osis in New York with a psychic there named Alex Tannhaus involved a target that would change at different times. It would shift around various objects, and he asked Tannhaus to go and describe what he saw in this target. When Tannhaus was able to describe the target correctly, he was setting off various types of electromagnetic and strain gauge and other devices around the target, which again says that our conscious body is external to the physical body. It travels to the location of where your consciousness is directing it during one of these out-of-body experiences. And so the kitten experiment is just one more example where Keith Harari, who is a parapsychologist, also very good at going out of body. He had a kitten who was very fond of him. They put the kitten in a box out in the middle of a field, and they had the bottom of the box marked off in squares so they could measure quantitatively when the kitten moved around. They also counted how many meows per minute this poor little kitten made. And when the kitten was just in the box by himself, they had a lot of meows per minute, and he crossed a lot of squares. Now Harari was in another building a half mile away or so. He went out of body and would in his mind go and attempt to comfort the kitten. When he was doing that, the kitten basically stopped meowing and stopped moving. So the comparison of data is night and day between when Harari was going OBE and when he wasn't. So the kitten knew that Harari was there. And there's a lot of other experiments like that also seem to indicate that kittens are pretty sensitive to the out-of-body energy. So this is just one example. I mean, but for me, it's interesting because it says there is a form of energy, of conscious energy, that's not physical. It's not part of the physical body, but there's this unknown energy form that's associated with the seat of consciousness, and that's another important part of physics that I think we need to address.
Yeah, I like the kitten one because it's good for the non-techs when you're talking about meows per second. It's a measurement for the experiment. That's something people can understand. But, this opens up, and the consciousness part, that's what I think is so interesting, that so many scientists are interested in this area, and it relates to UFO and these anecdotal stories about people interfacing with actual extraterrestrials, because a lot of these things are the things that people are describing. Consciousness, with thought, being able to control a craft, or with thought, they're able to control a human or communicate with a human. Or there have also been, these anecdotal stories that with thought alone, these entities are possibly able to dematerialize and rematerialize themselves. and it doesn't seem that too far out there compared to what you're talking about here.
Well, that's why, my book that I wrote several years ago is called The Synchronized Universe, and my website is synchronizeduniverse.com, and you can kind of go there and get a better idea for what I'm looking at. But that's what got me interested in this subject, that these phenomena, you see them in the UFO field, you see them in the parapsychology field. There is a long history of people studying these things and reporting these things over thousands of years, and they really they tell us pretty strongly that our current scientific model is missing some important pieces. The teleportation, the levitation, if you can do those things, if you can walk through a wall, then our ideas about matter, are not, still have some things that we're missing. And that may sound like a far-fetched idea to people, but in the 1970s, the Chinese government instituted a program called their EHF program, where they began collecting and trying to identify psychically gifted young people. And they found, a few dozen that were quite remarkable. And occasionally, the VIP visitors would go through Beijing and be treated to demonstrations. There was one man who was able to cause a 100-pound sack of flour to teleport kind of through a wall back and forth.
Wow.
There was a man named Zhang Baozheng who was quite famous during the 80s, who he was sort of showered with gifts by some of the Chinese leaders, and he had a car he would race around Hong Kong in, and they kept giving him traffic tickets for this car. But whenever the policeman got back to the station house, he found somehow that the record of the ticket had disappeared from his little booklet, and there was a general who was skeptical about Zhang Baozheng, so he had his soldiers lock in an office in the police in the military headquarters. And when the general got back to his house, he found Zhang sitting on his sofa waiting for him. So I mean, there are these fairly credible anecdotal stories that people have been able to do this. Uri Geller in the 70s did teleport a crystal out of a container in England in supervision by some physicists. So some of these quite controversial phenomena do seem to have basis in fact, although we don't have much real hard scientific evidence that's being published in the open literature about it. But for a physicist, when you hear something like that things that teleported out, that's pretty exciting. It tells us that our whole idea of matter is probably wrong. That probably matter must have more of a holographic property to it than our present theory says. So to me, it's very, very interesting. It says that there's a lot of interesting stuff here we can learn if we keep studying it.
And that's what's interesting about the consciousness piece is that, earlier we were talking about the metals and being able to, and we think very mechanically and building these machines that can change that vacuum or engineer that vacuum in that local space. But we seem to be finding that consciousness can do that as well. And what's interesting, it would be very interesting if we were able to discover how to do that. That technology happened before the machinery, where we're able to consciously make these changes without the craft or the machines.
Yeah, if you go into say India, for example, the tradition of the yogis or the shaman in many cultures, that there are long traditions going back thousands of years of these people being prized by their societies and being trained to do these things that in our Western society we write them off and just say, oh, that's impossible, and don't even consider it. But the Russians, even back in the 70s, were doing fairly extensive experiments with the yogis, because not only can they control body parameters like breathing and stop their heart and things like that, but a lot of much more challenging physical phenomena they could demonstrate. So I think we have a lot to learn from some of these old traditions.
Mm-hmm. And what's neat, another thing that's very interesting to me, especially when I saw your talk first, and to kind of share, if the audience can notice that I'm very comfortable with Claude, it's because I've known him for many years now. And a few years ago, the first time we met was, I don't even know if you remember, was in passing at the MUFON conference, because we had brought you to Denver for our symposium to do a workshop. And I think your workshop was at the same time as, one of my favorite people in this field as well, Leo Sprinkle. And so we had to choose between one or the other. And actually, I was so busy because I was working at it, I didn't even get to see all of Leo's. But you guys were at the same time, and you were the most popular workshops. Funny enough, you didn't know this person at that time either, but Stan was doing a talk in Leo Sprinkle's workshop. But all these synchronicities, like I know you talk about a lot. But then, so we brought you and Leo the next year as speakers at the symposium. In fact, we didn't do workshops. And everybody loved your talk there as well, because getting into all of these different aspects. So, yeah, we know each other. I brought you to Boulder to talk, and we've seen each other for a long time. In fact, some people may know, if they know me through UFOnaut or Coast to Coast, that I've also worked on the Stan Romanek case. And the Stan Romanek case is one where this gentleman purports to be an abductee, but he has what I believe, and I think you could share in this, an incredible amount of physical evidence that supports that case, so much so, and I've had my personal experiences with him that are unexplainable, that I cannot explain, and I do not believe Stan could have hoaxed these things that I've witnessed. There's no way he could have done that, and so even a third party out there that may be perpetrating a hoax on us, I don't know how they could do it. They would have to have some incredible resources. But you've looked at, because another aspect of Stan's case is that, you've become a personal friend with him and the family as well, and you were brought in to look at his equations, because he draws in the middle of the night these extremely complicated equations. And maybe if you could just comment, those equations that Stan draws, and you can go to his website at stanromanek.com, those equations seem too difficult, even difficult, and I've heard this from theoretical physicists, that they're difficult for theoretical physicists even.
Yeah, and to me what's really interesting is that they're all related to this subject we've been talking about tonight, which is engineering the vacuum. If you want to go faster than light, then you need to be able to change the conditions of the vacuum to be able to produce a wormhole or to warp space-time, to be able to control it in some practical way to make it do your bidding. And his equations all seem to relate to that. They relate to vacuum energy. One of his equations relates to how to produce a wormhole, and some of them seem to relate to the thresholds maybe of the magnetic fields you would need. The equations don't tell the whole story. I mean, there's not a complete set in there. Anyone who knows science knows that you need to have the words. An equation by itself is not sufficient. There needs to be definitions, there needs to be explanations to have a complete theory. So it's not a complete theory by any means. It's more like tantalizing little breadcrumbs, that kind of that are clues. But a lot of his equations have symbols which are commonly used in physics, and they are familiar enough that we can interpret what they mean. And so to me they're all germane to the subject, and I have learned a fair amount myself from studying them. So I found them useful, and therefore to me they indicate the presence of a pretty high level of intelligence and understanding. And I don't think that Stan would claim for a minute that he has that kind of knowledge of science. So there's to me they're helpful, and therefore I tend to find them credible if I were an advanced species that wanted to get the interest of the Earth people, I'd probably do something like that. You give them something that they can use, some things that are familiar enough to us that we can understand what they are, but that just lead us a little bit, along that direction toward a deeper understanding, so that we can say, that validates the whole experience. And the other thing is, as you well know, and as you mentioned too, when you hang around Stan, when you spend time with him, strange things happen. You see strange things, and I am one of these left-brain people who don't have much of any psychic experiences or UFO experiences. I've always been kind of jealous of the people who had them, and I wondered what was wrong with me, But my second and third UFOs I ever saw were standing next to Stan Romanek, outside on a clear day. So when that happens, you kind of have to consider that some form of validation, that's not just by chance.
Yeah, I noticed, because last time we met, I was trying to send you some psychic, talks. I didn't want to disturb the talk that was going on, and you didn't hear me at all. At first, I thought you were being rude and ignoring me, and I was like, "Wow, this guy can't do this." Just kidding.
I'm sorry.
I wish I could do that too. Yeah, sorry.
Send me an email, okay?
Yeah, send an email. I'll text you. That's the way we do it.
Okay.
So, but yeah, another thing, and I should mention this too, the Stan Romanek we're talking about is the guy, a lot of people who follow this field would know about the alien video that came out, and Larry King talked about it. He actually had Stan on, and it hit the news all over the place. Both of us were at the press conference where that was shown to the media, and then it went worldwide where, there's a little alien peering into the window, and I know that's rough, and I knew people would have a hard time with it. In fact, a lot of people listening to this show, a lot of people that hear me talk about the Romanek case in this video are like, yeah, right, this is a joke, and you've been hoaxing, all this stuff. But, if you've experienced what me and Claude have experienced, such as like you talked about, seeing a UFO, I've been with him, where we're watching, all of a sudden there's a bunch of satellites, and I call them satellites in the sky because they are moving in the same way a satellite would, but one kind of moves in a fishhook way and disappears. That's not a satellite. They don't do that. So, that does create a lot of excitement, and that's why I say, there's something to look at in this stuff. Now, and you say you've had your own personal experiences around Stan as well.
Right. And it's always nice to have that because, equations, people can always argue with them, but if you see something like that, it'd be hard to argue with it. Yeah.
So, and even film crews that have been around him lately have felt they have seen things as well. So keep an eye on that, people, and I wanted to talk to Claude about that so you have, more people who have seen, and there are other scientists involved with this, and I'll bring some more on later shows to talk about that. So that's how we know each other. In fact, my co-host, little Tessa here. You've met her as well.
You're a guard dog, right?
Yeah, out at the watchtower. So getting back, one of the notes that I wrote down here was on torsion, the concept of torsion, where you talked about the Russians and the Russians experimenting with the vacuum and how to manipulate the vacuum. If I understand correctly, too, in those understandings, and I've heard this. In fact, I've heard this. There's a guy who saw UFOs a lot, and supposedly a lot of people saw them with him, and he would get phone calls from these aliens, and they'd say, hey, we're going to show up, come to the backyard or out to the field, and he would go out there with his buddies, and sure enough, a UFO would come, and he said he would talk to the Venusians, and it all sounds kind of crazy, but he did have all these people with him, and I'm kind of stalling by adding more about him because I can't remember. Howard Menger, that's his name. But he also talked about...
That was back in the 50s, right?
Right, one of the contactees from the 50s. But he talked about gravity being a push force as opposed to a pull force. So not being pulled by the planet, but pushed by something else. Doesn't that theory talk about it being a push as well?
It probably does. I haven't seen it spoken of in those terms, but it would not surprise me. That would make sense to me, yeah.
Now, and there are other people who theorize about gravity being a push, right?
Right. I mean, because any force that decreases as the square of the distance basically kind of goes by the apparent cross section of the object. So when you are, go 4 times, if you're looking at how big the Earth is in the sky, and then you go twice as far away, the area in the sky that the Earth occupies is 1/4 as big, and therefore, if it's affecting the flux of energy around you, and that would be the push model, then the 1/r² could account for that. So it is kind of interesting. I mean, it certainly is a plausible theory. I mean, obviously there are, when you start discussing theories, you can make theories in so many different forms. There's so many different ways of making assumptions. But the basic idea of a push is pretty hard to rule out just on the face of it.
Yeah, so cool. So great. In the show so far, we've talked about a lot related to possible UFO technology, and that, it's possible we haven't ruled out that it's possible to move faster than the speed of light and travel vast distances in short amount of time, and also some of these supposed extraterrestrial visits or experiences that people have had, and some of those things they seem to do with their mind is also something that scientists individually have looked into that might be possible. I wanted to ask you, we've got about 15 minutes. So you, it seems, have found that there seems to be enough evidence out there regarding UFOs, and even that UFOs are piloted or related to extraterrestrials. You seem to feel that there is enough evidence out there to support that theory. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, as you start off. I started off as a mainstream physicist, believing everything I'd been taught in school, and you kind of go off of that track slowly, sort of step by step. And I think for me, the first thing was remote viewing, and then after that, I began to learn a few more things that I'd been kind of taught were hoaxes. Actually, if you look into them in great detail, there's a lot of evidence for them. And so to me, everything is based on evidence. You have to find out what's the evidence each way, because we're living in the internet age now where there's huge amounts of information, but a lot of it's not right. It's been distorted. And so you have to figure out for yourself what the truth is. And for me, I do that by just massive amounts of reading and studying. And eventually I figured out that, when you begin looking into the whole UFO question, you go back into the late 40s and the 50s. There were so many sightings and so many highly credible people. I mean, the Nathan Twining memo and Don Kehoe, and just so many military figures who saw them and reported them. And the evidence, the documentary evidence, is just overwhelming. If you to go off the beaten track and go back into the historical record, the data is just overwhelming to me. Yeah, I agree, and that's what really gets me into this, because kind of like Stephen Greer, part of the Disclosure Project, which got me involved with, brought out a lot of witnesses. It seems like, and we were talking about this earlier today, and it's something that I think is really interesting, because people bring up Occam's razor a lot in the movie Contact with the, about the SETI people, which is a wonderful movie. I love that movie, so don't get me wrong. Right. But you talk about Occam's razor a lot. But it seems that Occam's razor kind of tips the scales more towards an unconventional answer, because, for instance, if you take the situation of all of these military witnesses, it seems less likely, it seems almost impossible that over these many, many decades you would have these hundreds of military witnesses all conspiring to come up with this lie about UFOs, and then come out, and many of them come out and be active in this field, and we know some of them. So if you apply Occam's razor to that situation, it kind of it falls towards there being something to the phenomena rather than
this giant conspiracy or delusion?
Some of these people are highly credible, highly trained, and they had a lot to lose by coming out and saying what they did. I mean, Gordon Cooper, Jimmy Carter, who was governor of Georgia at the time. I mean, even Ronald Reagan was on record, as was his pilot, as being paced by UFO when he was governor of California. I mean, there's lots of generals who are on record. Helen Cotter, former head of the CIA. I mean, you can, if you start looking back into the record, there's a virtual who's who of people who go public that they saw it, yes, they had this experience, and you just can't really explain that kind of testimony away.
So then the next step, which is a little more difficult for some people, because some people may admit that, okay, there is a UFO phenomena, and I think that's interesting about these SETI guys in some of these Larry King debates that he's had, is they seem to admit, okay, we don't think these guys are lying, they saw something strange, but that next step, and they keep repeating, but I'm not ready to say I believe that this is extraterrestrial. What makes you then feel that there's evidence towards the extraterrestrial possibility?
Well, I mean, to me, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it doesn't matter where they're from. I mean, as long it's nobody I know. Nobody from my neyborhood.
Yeah.
They're not Americans. They're not Russians. They're not Chinese. They're not. So it's from somewhere else. Now, you can say, well, it's a different time, it's a different space, it's a different dimension, different planet. I mean, yeah, maybe all of the above. It doesn't.
Right.
I don't think we understand higher dimensions and parallel dimensions well enough to be arguing whether it's one or the other. And in my book Synchronized Universe, I talk about parallel dimensions. That comes out very naturally when you start looking into a more comprehensive model of space-time. One that could explain these events. Then you end up in parallel dimensions very naturally. So if you have an advanced civilization, it's totally plausible that they would find it easier to shift into some other dimension when they're doing their traveling, or maybe they live in another dimension. They just pop into ours to visit, And I don't think we know enough to be able to tell one from the other right now. But they're all interesting, and we know they're not local.
Yeah, and I don't think they're Chihuahuas, because I haven't seen my Chihuahua zap in and out of reality.
Well, you never know. She may surprise you one of these days.
Yeah, she does. I don't know how she gets out of her cage sometimes. So, related to some of that and the science around it, it seems to me, like you talked about, there have been a lot of individuals and efforts out there to do experiments into some of these fields. But to me, I kind of feel like, and my goal really is to get the media interested and the public interested, because I think that big goal is to get some of these institutions interested, because it seems like it's too difficult to think. It takes a lot of resources to look into these fields, and even the UFO phenomena, or the extra abductions, or even some of these areas of science that you're talking about. We really need to get these institutions involved, and of course you and these others have created the SSE. But how do you think we do that? How do you think we kind of break that kind of ban, or the ignorance around it in that arena?
I think it's grassroots. I think that it's going to have to be individual by individual. I think the institutions will come on board last. That's how it's been so far, and that's how it looks to me. You may get occasional wealthy individuals who will pony up some money to help out, but it just doesn't seem like the large public institutions are going to be, they'll be the last ones, in my opinion, that'll get on board. So, and I think that we individuals now have a lot of resources, whether with personal computers and internet and things like that, that individuals can do a lot when they get together in groups like MUFON. If you put resources together, people can carry out research projects. So, that's. I'm not holding my breath for the large institutions, until something on a large scale happens, And I mean, to me, the main thing is for individuals to educate themselves, to be skeptical of everything you hear, but to be open to just look in all possible directions to learn as much as you can and try to weigh it. Ask in your own heart, in your own intuition, is this sound right to you? Does this person sound honest to me? What's their motivation, and try to figure out the truth. And, I mean, to me, that's the big game that I think that we are in right now on this planet. One of them is our ability to distinguish truth from falsehood, our ability to develop our own perception, so we could figure out where the truth is, and act on that, and try to, there's so many different forces out there that would like us to move one way or the other, or behave in a certain way, and we have to sort out for ourselves what the truth is and follow it.
Yeah, it seems like a feeling with all of this is that personal discernment seems to be something that is important for us to grow and to create, and even kind of, dare I say, move away from dogmatic types of thought and to create your own type of discernment. Yeah, discernment. That's the watchword, I think. Do you see, or do you have peers coming up to you, or maybe colleagues from the past, seeming to be more interested in some of these arenas? Rarely. I rarely. It doesn't seem to be a huge movement. I think it comes in small. It's still, it's still individual by individual, I think. Mm-hmm. Well, what about the public interest in what you're doing? Do you see more of an interest that way? I do, and what I think I see is there are more professionals and more scientists who do respond and do take an interest, and more open-minded. I definitely see a trend in that direction, but it's hard to draw a straight line and make a projection based on my own experience. But it's definitely happening slowly. Yeah, one thing that I thought was really interesting when I really started getting involved with these fields and the organizations that are seriously looking into it is that it seems like a lot of the real players, a lot of the people doing most of the work are retirees, people of older generations. And I think a lot of people conceptualize these young, goofy kids who are kind of out there and rebelling against authority, and that's not the case. In fact, I'm by far one of the younger people, only in my mid-30s, still. We don't see many 20-year-olds. We don't see, people in their 20s or in their 30s. We're seeing a lot of people in the retiree age, and that was an interesting aspect to me because I think that's not what people expect when they get involved with this kind of stuff. And do you find that to be true as well? Yeah, I think so. I think that, well, for one thing, of course, when you retire, then you have more time. And it may have more resources at that point to be able to, go out there and do some projects on your own. You're young, you may have a family, may have a mortgage and things like that, and not have as much freedom. To me, and this is, probably a gross generalization, but for young people, what I see is more flexibility of consciousness. In other words, I think maybe because of the media and TV and movies, that some young people have a lot more awareness of
consciousness and of the power of consciousness and of altered states of consciousness, the higher dimensional spiritual nature that we have. And so they're more open-minded to some of these big questions, while the older generation, probably like me, you tend to be more engineering and more scientific oriented and kind of looking at it more in a left brain perspective. So we're kind of, we may be advanced for our own generation, but we may still be kind of square for the younger generation. So if I had to try to make a generalization, I might try to say that.
That's cool. And now that you say that, I could see that being true. And, finally I was able to get something positive out of you instead of this doom and gloom type of stuff. No, just kidding. But, no, I agree because, it is kind of like, old guy, astral projection, I was doing that last night kind of thing. But I agree with you. They seem to be, because of movies, real open to a lot of this. I think, and I like that what you're saying there. One thing that I think they could benefit from, if there's some young people listening here, is going to these meetings to hear the research, especially if you get to see Claude Swanson. You're definitely going to want to look at that. Because even though the movies touch on these things, it is about doom and gloom and fear as opposed to what these phenomena seem to really be about. A lot of people, when it comes to the extraterrestrial contact, see a lot of the scary stuff, even with ghosts and all of those other type of things. But that isn't what I found when I started looking into this. It seemed a lot different than that, and I think that's something they could benefit from.
But because the actual case reports in terms of the UFO encounters, and especially when there are contact cases and there are messages from these beings, things like that, that the information is much more spiritual and much more positive, and it's not at all like the scare tactics that you see in the Hollywood movies. And to me, I look at us humans and how we have sort of mismanaged the resources of our planet. That we're causing this incredibly high disappearance rate for species right now. The global warming that we're causing is very definitely real, despite all the misinformation out there in some of the media. There is real climate change going on. It's very rapid, and we have these wars going on around the planet. And so there's a real question whether we're, as Homo sapiens, really able to manage this planet. Do we have the intelligence? Can we get along with each other? Can we find a way to be peaceful and loving and get past all this scare and fear and doom and gloom and really kind of grow up and learn how to manage this place in a more enlightened way? And to me, some of the groups that, in my mind, are coming here have solved that problem. They are highly technological, but they didn't destroy themselves. They got through. Period. And of course, in the movie Contact, Jodie Foster, in her hearing at the end of the movie, makes this comment. How did you get through this particular phase of your own evolution? And they all got through it. And most of them are, I think, much more psychic and much more empathic than we are. And so, there's something there for us to learn. And so, to me, that would be something that the young people might be able to glean if they can, get past all the scary stuff,
All right. Well, it's the end of the show. We've just got a few seconds here, so thanks for being on. We'll have you on again as we talk more about this stuff. It's a great pleasure. I think people are going to love hearing this, and just so people know, this time is, I'm going to try to stick to similar times and or one set time so we can have live people come in and live people call, but you can always go hear the latest interview at UFOthinktank.com. But Synchronized Universe, we've got your link on the web page. Thanks for being on, Claude. And
Thank
you
you.
Have a
Thank
lovely
you,
evening.
Alejandro. Thank
And
you for all your wonderful work. Great job. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's wonderful to bring this incredible information to people. So Same with you. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great evening, and we'll talk to you next week. Go to UFO Think Tank for the latest interviews and information on who will be up next. You'll love the next show, too. Thanks.